Hello again, video freaks and AV geeks. It's Dr. Yo in your face once more with video synth tools and techniques, in which I attempt to share what I've learned about video synthesizers and the LZX modular ecosystem. It's been about a year and a half since my last video. I've had quite a few projects in that time, and I'll share two broad strokes for you that are specifically relevant to this video. I've completed 3 short animated films using the synthesizer, and those have screened internationally. I'm most proud of Christofascist, which is a music video for my friend's Nervous Gender Reloaded. And unfortunately, that has been banned by the YouTube bots, but you can view that at my website, which is dr-yo.com. The other thing that's really relevant is I want to share that I am so proud to have been asked by LZX to contribute to the official module documentation for Gen 3. And this has been a fantastic experience for me. So thank you, Lars. Thank you, LZX. And also thank you, Ramin Rani, for the incredible animations and illustrations. This is a work in progress at this current moment. It's about halfway finished. We are trying to create the best documentation available in this industry, and I think we're doing pretty well so far. So when it's finished, of course, there will be an announcement on the official LZX blog. The subject of this epic feature-length video is randomness, chaos, and uncertainty. And it's a big topic. I'm only going to be able to cover some slices of that topic. And I also want to talk a bit about the theory or the concepts, because I think that's very helpful. It will transcend any particular module or patch so that you will have sort of the conceptual building blocks of how you can work with random, aleatoric, or chaotic systems in video synthesizer land. Then in a series of video synth demos, we will apply randomness and chaos to specific patches. We'll see how we can integrate noise, uncertainty, entropy into the mix of our patch. If you want to take a deep dive into the concepts and history of randomness and chaos in audio synthesis, I recommend a series of 3 articles on the Perfect Circuit website. Perfect Circuit is a Los Angeles synthesizer store. And the articles are written by Naomi Mitchell, who is a synth maker, and you can find her work at omiindustries.com. Let's begin our discussion of the concepts of randomness and chaos. They're closely related to information, so we should start with that. What exactly is information? Well, we can start by defining it through what it's not. First of all, it's not meaning. It allows us to differentiate between different messages, but it has no meaning in the sense of it has significance. That is the domain of semiotics, which is the study of signs and symbols. It's an outgrowth of linguistics, but it directly applies to all communication media, such as video. And I'd love to do a video about the semiotics of video at some point, but that's off topic today. Information is not meaning. It's also not data. Data is the carrier of information, but we can easily have a lot of data with no information. For example, a frame of black video is about 8 megabytes uncompressed for a full HD frame. So that's an example of taking up a lot of data, but no information. There's no message, there's no content. We haven't learned anything from the transmission of a black frame. So what is information? One definition is that it's the distinction between possibilities. If we can reliably distinguish between different possibilities, messages, then we have information. Information is also what we gain when we receive and decode a message. Information is a measurable quantity, and it's measured by something called entropy, which is the unpredictability of the message. It's literally the average surprise. How surprised will we be when we decode the message? That's entropy. Entropy can be calculated using a formula which has variables such as the length of the message, the number of possible symbols such as characters or numbers, and the probability distribution of those characters or numbers. How often are they likely to appear within the message? Claude Shannon laid the foundations of information theory at Bell Labs, and he used the term entropy because his formula was similar to that of thermodynamic entropy. But it turned out later that, in fact, information entropy, thermodynamic entropy, and so-called algorithmic entropy are all the same thing. They're all about what we don't know about a system. So how does all this apply to video art? It gives us some creative tools to make more interesting moving images. Now we know that randomness is a state of high entropy, and entropy is the average surprise. Surprise is novelty, and novelty sustains interest over time. But pure randomness by itself is not that interesting for several reasons. First of all, novelty is not the only way to sustain interest. A purely novel image that we've never seen before isn't exciting to us if we don't care about it. So the content of the message matters just as much as its surprise. Novelty also needs to be balanced with predictability. The most engaging communication systems are those that provide intermittent rewards at random intervals, and that'll keep the audience engaged. The most effective teaching methods are ones that interleave new information with concepts and knowledge that the student already has. And novelty is subjective anyway. We can easily get used to and tune out a noise source such as video snow, and that's called habituation. And it happens unconsciously. So if we have a perfectly random source like video snow, from an information point of view, it has very high entropy, it's very complex. But from a perceptual, psychological point of view, it's not changing at all. It's just always the same pattern of white noise, and that's why we call it static. Randomness and chaos are extremely useful building blocks, but a work needs to have some kind of structure in order to keep the audience engaged. We need to balance the unpredictability of a high entropy system with the predictability of a narrative. If we're able to find that balance, then we can create interesting, engaging works that are going to both challenge and satisfy the expectations of the audience. Getting into the specifics of what kind of information we're working with, we can talk about time and space. In video synth land, an analog video signal is basically three values moving over time, the red, green, and blue channels. But we can also think of each individual frame as a two-dimensional object that's static and unchanging. That's how we perceive it, and digital systems work this way also. They sample entire frames at once. So we could think of video as three analog values constantly changing, or we could think of it as a series of color images being presented very quickly in succession. So even though everything in analog video is time-based, we can think of individual frames as being spaces. We can create noisy or chaotic imagery or patterns within the space of the frame or in the space across multiple frames. And that might be a low frequency control voltage that's animating some other parameter such as the brightness of an image. We can categorize time-based effects or animation into two basic categories, instantaneous or continuous. Now, there is no such thing as instantaneous in the real world. Everything takes some amount of time to happen. But our perception is limited, so something happening very fast to us appears to happen instantaneously. So, for example, cutting from one scene to another, that would be an instantaneous transition. Entropy, or uncertainty, can be observed in either a deterministic or a probabilistic system. What does that mean? A deterministic system is one in which we can directly track cause and effect. We can actually see and measure cause and effect occurring in a system. And if we're able to run a system multiple times with the same initial conditions, if it's deterministic, we'll get the same outcome every time. However, that does not mean that we can predict the outcome. That's a separate consideration, and we'll come back to this when we talk about chaos theory. A probabilistic system is one in which we cannot directly observe cause and effect, even if we know it to exist. Maybe the system is so complex that there are so many moving parts, there's no way that we can actually track cause and effect. And yet, we can still predict outcomes of that system. So, for example, for a gas, it's moving around so much at the micro scale that we cannot possibly track cause and effect. But we can use statistical mechanics and thermodynamics in order to predict what the system is going to do at a macro scale. Another example would be a coin toss. Every time we toss a coin, it's either going to come up heads or tails. So on one level, it has high entropy because it's a novel result every time. But on another level, it has low entropy because we know it's always going to be either a 0 or 1. And if we run enough trials, then we will see that the probability of a particular result, heads or tails, in the long run is going to be 50%. And that is accurate, and that is something that we can rely on. So again, it has low entropy. Deterministic and probabilistic systems roughly correspond to the concepts of chaos and randomness, respectively. Chaos theory is also known as complexity science or dynamic systems. It's not disorder. Chaos is a form of order that emerges from the interaction of relatively simple rules and variables. And it's also a type of order that may be unpredictable. So a classic example is the three-body problem. Imagine three planets orbiting one another in outer space. Their paths are chaotic. We cannot predict what it's going to do. We can run a simulation if we set initial conditions, and we can calculate what the result will be from those conditions. But we are unable so far to generalize that into a formula that can serve as a predictive model. So the three-body problem is unsolved to this day. A common characteristic of dynamic systems is sensitive dependence on initial conditions. Tiny changes can have very large effects. That's sometimes known as the butterfly effect. An example from video art is video feedback. If we change anything in the feedback system, such as the camera exposure or the settings on our synthesizer, we may get completely different results that we could never predict. True randomness does not follow a script. It's not deterministic at all. And randomness comes in two major flavors: quantum and classical randomness. Quantum randomness or quantum uncertainty is insane because quantum events happen apparently without any cause that we've been able to find. And that completely contradicts, our intuitive sense of how the universe works. Spinoza, the famous philosopher, said that there are no uncaused events. Well, apparently he was wrong. For the purposes of an electronic circuit, we can rule out any quantum randomness. The quantum random effects are going to be negligible except at extremely low temperatures and extremely low energy states. Classical randomness can be found in all electric circuits. In any electrically conducting material, we will see a phenomenon called Johnson noise or thermal noise. And that's the effect of the particles moving around randomly. And in a conducting material, that equates to a constantly fluctuating voltage. And there's absolutely nothing we can do about this except to super chill the metal down to absolute zero. So for practical purposes, for all electronics, there's going to be some level of noise. Usually we want to suppress that noise or at least make it low relative to the signal. But we can also exploit that noise. And we can use techniques such as feedback and amplification to use that random noise source that's always inherent in every electric circuit. Thermal noise is the ultimate form of radical chaos. It's so chaotic that it actually crosses the line into truly random. It's deterministic in the sense that everything that happens in that system is caused by something that we could theoretically measure. But it's probabilistic because, practically speaking, we cannot take those measurements. We would need to have perfect knowledge of the state of every single particle in the material at all times. We would also need infinite processing power and infinite memory. So none of those things are possible, even theoretically. So even though Johnson noise is deterministic, it's purely random, and it's an ultimate entropy source. Johnson noise is at one end of the randomness spectrum. Digital devices, such as computers, are way at the other end. They're designed with a very high signal-to-noise ratio, so that the noise that's inherent in the digital circuit is far below the voltage that would be required to interfere with the data. Now, computers and digital devices use logic gates in order to calculate things. And because they're perfectly logical, they cannot be random. Random is irrational. So a computer cannot actually produce a random string of numbers. However, a computer or digital device can create a string of values that is so apparently random that it will easily fool the humans. And as an aside, fooling the humans is a huge area of information theory. For example, the video that you're watching right now uses perceptual coding to lossy compress the video. It throws away a whole lot of information that we probably won't notice is missing. So it's an exploit, but it's one that we need, practically speaking, in order to have things like internet video. So there's no such thing as random in a computer, but it can be pseudo-random well enough to fool the humans. A common, very simple binary algorithm for random or chaotic output is the shift register. And we'll see an example of that later using Rob Hordijk's Rungler circuit, which incorporates the shift register with some digital feedback. Continuous fluctuation is an interesting balance between randomness and predictability, and it's very useful in many contexts. The idea was pioneered in the audio domain by Don Buchla with his very famous source of uncertainty module. We will be exploring the tip-top audio version of that very extensively in this video. Chaos and randomness can be achieved with various forms of feedback, in which we send the output of some system back into its input. And feedback is a deterministic system that can go chaotic if the conditions are perfectly balanced. And one example of that we'll see later is with the stairs module, and we can create patterns similar to this. A classic example of feedback is, of course, video feedback or optical feedback, in which a camera is pointed at a monitor that's displaying the output of the camera. The other type of feedback you're probably familiar with is mixer feedback, or E to E, so-called electronic to electronic feedback, in which we send the video signal through some electronic loop. Now, those topics are very, very deep, and there are many, many techniques for video feedback, far too much for us to cover in this video. So that would require at least one other feature-length video to cover video feedback. But again, it is a classic example of chaotic systems. And in fact, it was one of the early systems that was studied by the scientists who initially developed chaos theory or dynamic systems. If we consider the horizontal and vertical dimensions of a video frame, then we could think of a moving video image as having 6 degrees of freedom, or 6 variables. It's got horizontal, vertical, red, green, blue, and time. So because it's got those 6 independent variables, there's a lot going on in video feedback, which is how we can get so many different kinds of complex patterns. On the other end of the spectrum is control voltage feedback, which is just a single value moving through time. It's much simpler than video feedback. And we'll see some examples, such as feedback from two oscillators, frequency modulating one another, or two envelope generators, changing the envelope times of one another. That will create some chaotic movement in that control voltage output. We'll also see binary digital feedback with the Rungler circuit, and we'll see high frequency feedback using stairs. When we get up to a certain high frequency for that control voltage, it will actually turn into an image, such as TV snow. Even just a simple feedback loop with one input and one output can give very complex results. And as you start to add more inputs and outputs and more variables into the feedback loop, you're going to get more complex results. Here's an example from my own work. When I was a graduate student at CalArts, I set up a feedback loop with 3 monitors and 3 cameras and 2 switchers in order to get a very interesting, complex, organic look to the feedback. Randomness and chaos are so important to analog synthesis that you will find a bewildering array of options for modules. It's really an embarrassment of riches, but that's a good problem to have. I'm not going to be able to cover even a small fraction of your options, but I'll cover some of the most important ones, specifically the ones that I own. And the most important one really is the original. The classics never go out of style. Don Buchla's source of uncertainty. There are many versions of it. It started as model number 265, and now it's better known as the 266. Tip Top Audio has done an amazing job of bringing it to the Eurorack world. So we'll have a lot of fun exploring all the different things that source of uncertainty can do. I'll also be making extensive use of some pulp logic tiles. You see them here. These are 1U tiles. They're very inexpensive, but they tend to take up a lot of HP space. But for me, that's good. They're simple, they're straightforward and intuitive, and especially in a complex patch, I want to have kind of big knobs and really obvious functions so that I can really, save my brain space for making beautiful art instead of trying to figure out, okay, well, what does this knob do in this mode and so on. The tiles we'll look at specifically include V noise, which produces randomly timed pulses, the RND tile, which produces random values when it sees a new pulse, and the slew tile, which is going to provide a low-pass filter effect similar to the source of uncertainty. It's going to transition out of random values. I'm also a big fan of Ornament and Crime Plus from Plum Audio. This is an extended version of Ornament and Crime that supports variable output range. So I can set it to plus minus 5 volts or 0 to 10 volts to match a Eurorack standard. It also has built-in attenuverters. And I've loaded the Hemispheres firmware because it has some very valuable applets we'll look at. First of all, VectMorph, which is essentially a low-frequency wavetable synthesizer. We can map any incoming voltage onto a position on a waveform and output a new voltage level. And we'll use that to change the probability distribution of some of our random and chaotic sources. The other applet that we'll look at is Rungler, which is the shift register circuit from Rob Hordijk, known as the Rungler. And there are many, many other options out there for various and sundry chaotic and random sources in Eurorack audio. Wogglebug, marbles, 3-body, oh my! Wogglebug, that's one from Grant Richter of Wired, resurrected by Make Noise. And then Marbles is from the former Mutable Instruments, which shut down in 2022, but there are many clones out there because Mutable Instruments published all of their designs as open source. And the other one I just mentioned is three-body, which is from Schlappy Engineering, and that's one in which there are 3 megahertz frequency oscillators all feeding into one another in a digital circuit. And that's an amazing one that I also do not own, but definitely worth looking at if you want to produce chaotic patterns. There's an entire company devoted to Eurorack modules for chaos and randomness, and that is nonlinear circuits. Andrew Fitch has designed an entire line of different random and chaotic modules, the most famous of which is sloths or sloths. And currently, nonlinear circuits is DIY only. The first type of chaotic circuit I'd like to talk about is frequency modulation, or FM. That's where the frequency of a bass wave, called the carrier, is varied over time by some other wave, called a modulator. The distribution of values is determined by the type of carrier wave. This is a sine wave, which is weighted towards the extreme values at the peaks and valleys. Here we see many cycles of the frequency modulated signal superimposed. If the modulation amount is high enough, then new amplitude distributions are introduced. I do want to mention that these animations are not scientifically or mathematically perfect. They're just good enough to get the point across. They're teaching tools, not simulations. Now that we know how frequency modulation works, let's take a look at a demonstration using cross-modulation of 2 oscillators in order to create chaotic animation patterns. Maybe the simplest way of creating a chaotic system is feedback. In this case, I have 2 oscillators coming from DWO3 that are cross-modulating. Oscillator 1 is providing the frequency modulation for oscillator 2, and oscillator 2 is providing the frequency modulation for oscillator 1. And the important part of this is that one of them has to be inverted. We'll see here this attenuverter here is pointing to the left, meaning that I'm inverting the incoming signal, which is again coming from the other oscillator. As oscillator 1 rises, it's going to send a higher value out to oscillator 2, which is going to cause oscillator 2 to run more slowly because of the inversion. So they're going to push one another back and forth. One's trying to speed everything up, and the other's trying to slow everything down, and they will never reach agreement. We can take a look at these one dimension at a time. I've got them set up on my SMX3. So there's a horizontal dimension just by itself. And we can see that we're getting a chaotic waveform. It's not a predictable pattern. It's changing speed even in the middle of each oscillation duty cycle. Okay, and then we've got the other dimension vertically. Same thing there. We don't have any discernible pattern because it's constantly speeding up and slowing down due to the cross-modulation feedback. All right, I'll bring back the other dimension. So we got our screensaver working again. But of course, this is video synthesis, right? So we have to have a surrealist screensaver. And that's what this is all about. I'm using the other 2 oscillators I have in this rack, this other DWO3 here, set to video rate in order to modulate the picture. I will say that you do need to spend some time tweaking those knobs and getting them dialed in exactly right, and watching your scope or screen while you check to see if it's actually producing a repeating pattern, because there's quite a lot of knob settings in which you will get a static pattern that repeats. But if you set both of the oscillators to approximately the same frequency and this approximately the same amount of frequency modulation, then you should get an unstable system. Here's a variation on that chaotic oscillator concept using the Make Noise Maths module, the most popular Eurorack module of all time, because it does so many things. In this case, I'm using it as a dual envelope generator, and each one of those envelope generators is affecting the rise and fall time of the other. Once again, cross-patching. In this case, I'm taking the variable output of channel 1, and that's going into the both input of channel 4. In other words, that signal is increasing both the rise and fall time, slowing down the envelope or oscillation. And likewise, we're going in the other direction. We're taking the variable output of channel 4 here and plugging that into the both input of channel 1. I've enabled the cycle for both channel 1 and channel 4. And what else can I tell you about this? Oh, yes, important. We've inverted the output of channel 1. So it is just like the patch we saw with DW03, one of them needs to be inverted. And it is important that we use the variable outputs, these ones here, because we really need to attenuate that signal before it goes into the both input of the other channel. So you see it's set to only about the 11 o'clock position. These knob settings are extremely delicate. And unlike DW03, there's a lot going on inside the math circuit. For example, we have the ability to change the wave shape to an exponential or logarithmic. So I can play around with that and see what it does. It's giving me a snappier movement just on one end of the excursion here. In other words, the oscillator is bouncing back and forth, and only on one side is this knob actually affecting the speed. So it's not symmetrical. I could do a bouncing ball kind of effect if I unplug one of these. So we're only seeing the vertical dimension currently. And if I increase the exponential control for that channel, we'll get this effect of a ball bouncing up and down. Okay, that's a bit extreme. We'll dial that back a little bit. But again, these knobs are extremely delicate, and you'll need to spend even more time tweaking this in order to get a truly chaotic system. Put this back the way I had it. Plug my other dimension back in. I'm just taking those unity outputs of channel 1 and channel 4 and passing them through at-off from pulp logic. And that's just attenuating the signal because the maths output is up to 10 volts. And I want to send that, of course, to the LZX system. And that is expecting a 1 volt signal. So the output of the at-offs is coming to this proc. And the add-off is actually a really good choice for this because we just want to attenuate. We don't want to invert necessarily. And because it's only an attenuator, that means I have a lot more range with the knob. Because if it's an attenuverter, then half of the range of the rotation of the knob is devoted to inversion. With proc, it's sometimes difficult to dial down a 10 volt signal to just 1 volt because you don't have very much range with that knob. Going back to maths, you may see more of a tendency towards repeating patterns, or at least chaotic attractors that want a signal to go to a certain place. And that's just, again, because of the complexity of maths as opposed to a simple oscillator. And because I'm not using any exponential or logarithmic curve currently, I'm getting this sort of linear effect. It's almost like the triangle wave we were using with DW03. Maybe we want to make this better, more artistic. We could add some slow in, slow out using VU005. Once again, I've got the outputs of at-off going into proc. I'll unplug those and put them into VU005. You could do it with just one module. Since I've got several, I'm just going to go into the A inputs of a couple of them, just because the knobs are at the top. Makes it a little bit easier for me to reach. And then plug those into proc. Let's see what that gives us. Now we've got a slow in, slow out effect going on. And I've done this by applying a symmetrical sine wave shape. It's important that the VU005 shape knobs are at the 12 o'clock position. That way we'll get a symmetrical wave shape. Then we need to readjust our maths, play around with the rise and fall times, and of course the attenuverters, which are controlling the amount of frequency modulation or envelope time modulation. These are very sensitive once again, and also the exponential logarithmic knobs need to be tweaked. Just because the mark shows where it's supposed to be linear, that doesn't necessarily mean it actually is linear at that location. All right, that's how to cross-modulate the 1 and 4 channels of maths in order to create chaotic periods for the envelope generators and producing the effect of 2 chaotic oscillators. And additionally here, we're going through view 05 to add a little bit of slow in, slow out. The other type of modulation is amplitude modulation, or AM, and that's when the gain or the intensity of a carrier wave is modulated by some other wave, usually by multiplying the two of them. In this example, a periodic oscillator is modulated by a chaotic oscillator. The frequency is constant, but the amplitude changes randomly. If we superimpose many cycles of that modulated carrier, we reveal peaks and valleys at regular intervals. And that's because the carrier wave is rhythmic and periodic. It only has varying amplitudes. In this illustration, the modulation strength is so low to make the point that the carrier frequency is constant. Higher modulation amounts will give greater output fluctuation. Just as with high modulation amounts, FM will introduce new amplitudes to a signal. AM may introduce new frequencies into the signal as well. If you want to do amplitude modulation in a video patch, at first blush you might think you can just put your signal through a VCA, or voltage controlled amplifier, or that you could just multiply two signals. Well, unfortunately, in the land of video, it's a little bit more complicated than that. If we multiplied two signals that are unipolar in the LZX video standard from 0 to 1, then the scaling operation will take place around 0. So basically, all of your images are going to fade to black. And that's maybe the effect that you're going for, but it's not actually amplitude modulation in the strictest sense. If you wanted to do an AM type effect, then you would want to use a 4-quadrant multiplier, and it would need to be one that is biased for the LZX standard, placing the center of the scaling operation at middle gray or 0.5. The module you want for that is factors. You could also use the Synth Cadran module. It has a 4QM mode as well. The fader submodule of bridge is also capable of a 4-quadrant multiplication operation by patching the inputs and outputs of bridge to itself. For interesting chaotic low-frequency modulation, we can use the source of uncertainties fluctuating random voltages. And this is going to give an effect similar to the random amplitude modulation graph I showed you earlier. In the source of uncertainty, the value is instantaneously randomized at every clock pulse. And between pulses, those random values are smoothly interpolated by a slew circuit. The transition time of the slew is controlled by the same clock pulse. If we visualize the fluctuating random voltage over some period of time, we can analyze the effect of the sample rate. The values change according to a fixed clock or tempo. We see the peaks and valleys land at semi-regular intervals that are determined by that clock pulse or tempo. The clock pulse happens at the same interval each time, but if we get a similar result in 2 or more successive samples, then we won't see the peak and valley oscillation that we might see otherwise. For the most chaotic type of fluctuating random voltage, we can employ random frequency modulation. We can send the output of one fluctuating random voltage to the frequency modulation or clock input of the other. We can also add cross-modulating feedback, just as we did with a periodic oscillator or envelope generator. Each fluctuating random voltage modulates the frequency or clock of the other. And this gives perhaps even better results than combining chaotic AM and FM, and it's much easier to set up and much more controlled. If we superimpose many passes of this fluctuation, then we can see that there's no discernible pattern to the sample rate. We don't get peaks and valleys at the same locations on successive passes. Here's the source of uncertainties fluctuating random voltages applied to the ramps in the synthesizer patch in order to modulate the shape. But in this patch, I've taken it a step up from there, in which the fluctuating random voltages are feeding into one another, causing the fluctuating random voltage to fluctuate in its speed. So we've got some frequency modulation going on here. We can see that on the oscilloscope. Those two lines indicate the value of the fluctuating random voltage at any moment in time. And note that the values are fluctuating, but also the rate at which those values are fluctuating is itself fluctuating. So we've got a really cool effect here of this chaotic motion. We can now look at the overall patch. Let's take a look at that. Here is the source of uncertainty that's driving those ramp modulations. And in order to bring the fluctuating random voltages into the correct range for frequency modulating the other channel, I needed to go through some attenuator, and I'm using the Ornament and Crime Plus with the Hemispheres firmware. And let's take a look at that in close-up. I've got the Aten off applet loaded, and I've dialed each one of those channels down to 33%, and I've also biased it way down to -5 volts. That's the extreme low end of that range. Cool. So that's a pretty complex situation. Let's simplify this. I'm going to tear this down and build it back up again. Here's the simplest case in which I've just got a single fluctuating random voltage that's controlling the modulation of one of my ramps, either horizontal or vertical. And the only control I really need to worry about here is the speed of that fluctuation. I can adjust that with the knob here and make that crazy, or I can mellow that out a little bit. And of course, I can connect the other fluctuating random voltage to modulate the other ramp, plug that in, and now they're both in effect. And that's pretty cool, pretty simple. Let's take a look at the overall patch now. The modulation is pretty simple, but the actual video patch is pretty complex. It's basically taking H and V ramps from TBC2 and mutating them in weird and wonderful ways. And the main thing that we're seeing with modulation is that we are adding to the ramps, and we're also adding to the frequency modulation of some oscillators. Additionally, if we go down a little bit further here, we'll see that there's a little bit more going on. I'm using VU05 and the triple function generators to colorize. And at the very bottom, we've got a bridge, and that is dividing the signal by 5 because the output of the source of uncertainty is from 0 to 10 volts. Let's level this up by fluctuating the rate of fluctuation. I'm just going to use one output. That's going to be the top output. That's the channel 1 output. Disconnect the second output because I want to use that as the source for frequency modulation of the first generator. And we can see that we're getting changes in speed, but they're pretty extreme changes in speed. It's not really the gentle look that I'm going for, and it's all due to this input attenuation knob here. If we bring that up, we can really see the effect of frequency modulation is really kind of going out of control here. So if I bring this value down, eventually I can cause that to sort of chill out a little bit. But unfortunately, it's not really giving me the effect I want because it's still got a really wide range of amplitude there. And I can't really bring this knob down enough in order to kind of chill this out and make it the way I want it to be. So that's when I need to go through some attenuation circuit. and that, of course, is the OCP. So instead of sending that output directly to the other input, I'm going to send it to the ornament and crime. Take that output, plug it into one of the inputs of ornament and crime plus, and then take that output, send it to the other input of the source of uncertainty. And as we saw previously, I've got the OCP dialed down to 33%, and I've really reduced the bias as well by 5 volts. I'll bring this attenuation knob up again, and let's see the result that we get. So this is what I was going for. I want the rate of fluctuation to change, but I don't want it to swing between those real extremes. So this is just one channel. Let's talk about doing the other channel as well. That's going to be a little bit more involved. I'm going to need some mults. And to do that, I've got the tip-top audio stack cables ready to go. So let me pull these out. I want to take the output of generator 1, and that's going to go to the OCP input number 1. And that then is going to get multed off to control my video patch. And likewise with the other channel, I want to take the output of generator 2, go into OCP channel 2, and that's going to get multed as well, sending off to the video patch. So at this point, it's just as if I had connected the outputs of the source of uncertainty directly, getting the same result that I would have had if I wasn't going through OCP, because I'm not doing any frequency modulation yet. We're going to take the output of OCP channel 1. I'm going to use a red cable for that. I'm using red to indicate horizontal ramps. So this is channel 1 output. That's going to go into the input of channel 2. And the other way around, we've got the output of channel 2. It's going to go to the input of generator channel 1. And then adjust these input knobs. And of course, adjust the ornament and crime plus as well, but I've already done that. Okay, that's a result I was going for. I'm using each generator to control the rate of change of the other generator. And we've got some nice feedback going on here. And it's all accomplished by bringing those input values down into a range that's going to be aesthetically pleasing. It's often said that in video synthesis, things come in threes. Well, of course, we have 3 primaries, red, green, and blue. And if you're like me, when you got your source of uncertainty in front of you, you're thinking, gee, I wish there was a third fluctuating random voltage. Well, guess what? We can roll our own using the quantized random voltages and the integrator submodules. And that's exactly what I've done here. I've got 3 bands of white that are being amplitude modulated. They're going through a VCA. And that VCA is being driven by source of uncertainty, fluctuating random voltages for the bar on the left, the bar in the center, and the bar on the right is coming ultimately from this integrator output here. So the basic concept here is we're going to reproduce what the fluctuating random voltages submodule does under the hood, behind the panel. What is going on? It's sampling a noisy signal at a certain interval, which is set by either the knob or the incoming signal or some combination of those two. That is the sample rate of the system. Every so often, it's going to sample that random noise. The next stage is for it to go through a slew or integrator circuit, which is basically a low-pass filter, and it's going to even out the transitions so that we get smooth fluctuating random voltages and not stair-step transitions like we would if there was no low-pass filter there. So what we can do is use the quantized random voltages, which is going to give us some stair-stepped quantized voltages out. We can put that quantized random voltage through the integrator submodule, which is going to apply that slew effect, giving us the nice graceful transitions from one state to another. We need also to supply a pulse to the quantized random voltages. It doesn't have an oscillator built into it, so we need to cause it to trigger from a pulse. And the rate of that pulse can be set by a secondary control. In other words, we can frequency modulate an oscillator, which will cause that pulse to speed up or slow down, and use that same secondary control to drive the inputs to the fluctuating random voltages so that we can adjust the speed of all of them at once. The last part of this puzzle is controlling the slew time of the integrator. We want it to track with the frequency of our modulation. As we increase the modulation, we're going to want to have a shorter slew time. But that's the opposite of what we would get if we just plugged that control voltage in directly. Anything coming in to this integrator control voltage is going to increase the wavelength or period. But again, we need the opposite of that. So I simply ran the control voltage, the frequency modulation, into ornament and crime and used it as an inverter. That's all it's doing here. So I'm inverting the control voltage so that the slew time is going to be shorter when the pulse frequency is higher. Okay, so where is this control voltage coming from? I've got it over here on the other side of my rack. Let's take a look at that. I've got this mat module over here that's providing a static voltage that is driving the frequency of the fluctuating random voltages and also of this Baja. And it could be any oscillator. You would probably want to use a square wave oscillator, but instead I have comparators. So I'm taking the output of Baja, running it through a comparator that's actually bumping it up to 5 volts also, so that it will actually trigger the pulse input of the source of uncertainty quantized random voltages. So I can change the frequency here. You can't see me change the knob value, but imagine that you can see it. I'm just reducing that frequency, and it's working on all 3 of those fluctuating random voltages, the 2 stock ones and the one that I created out of bits and pieces of other modules. Cool. That is how we can create our own fluctuating random voltage. The fluctuating random voltages submodule is an example of randomness, but it's a continuous randomness that's constantly changing and varying in a way that we can actually observe. The other broad category of randomness is instantaneous, in which the transition time is so short that we can't perceive it happening. In the simplest case, the sample rate or clock is constant. The time interval between values is fixed at a particular frequency. And also, in the simplest case, the probability distribution is flat. Any value is as equally likely as any other value. Let's see an example of this technique using the quantized random voltages submodule of the source of uncertainty. I want to talk a little bit more about the quantized random voltages and explain how it operates, because we previously used it, but we didn't really go into what good settings might be for quantized random voltages. I'm using it here to drive an offset to horizontal and vertical ramps. I've got the 2 to the nth output driving the horizontal ramp and the n+1 output driving the vertical ramp. And we can see in the video actually that it's moving a little bit in between these events, and that's actually due to some instability in the system. But in any event, we're getting this cool pattern effect. Let's talk about these just one at a time. I'm going to unplug the n+1 output, and we'll just take a look at the 2 to the nth power output by itself. When I look at these little diagrams here, I get the impression that this one's going to give me an even distribution and that this one's going to give me a bell curve distribution. But in fact, that is not what they do at all. Regardless of which output you use, you're going to get a random value every single time a pulse is received at this input here. And I'm using my ornament and crime to do that. So I've just got ornament and crime plus, and it is putting out a pulse 3 times a second. Okay, so 2 to the nth power, what is that doing? Every time a pulse is received, it's going to look at this quantization knob, which goes from 1 to 6, or to an incoming voltage value. Every time a pulse is received, a noisy signal is sampled, and it can then take the number of possible values as determined by this simple formula, 2 to the nth power. If quantization is set to 3, for example, we will get 2 to the third power possible values out, which is 8. So if we bring this down to quantization of 1 and plug my modulation back in, we're doing a coin flip. Every time a pulse is received, a new random value is going to be generated, but it's going to be quantized to only 2 possible values, 2 to the first power. If I bring this up to 2, then we've got 2 to the second power. That gives us 4 possible values. And 3 is 2 to the third power, 8 values, 16 values, 32 values, 64 possible values. Okay, and the higher that quantization number goes up, the less likely it is we're going to get the same exact value twice in a row. So the higher that number is, the more regular it appears that the update is occurring. But that's an illusion. It's just simply because if we had it set to 1, there would be a 50-50 chance of getting the same value twice in a row or not. Okay, and then we have the other one, n plus 1. And as you can probably figure, this is going to take the quantization number and add 1 to it. And that will give us the number of possible values out. If quantization is set to 1, then n plus 1 will give us 2 possible values once again. So for both of the outputs, if the quantization value is set to 1, we will get a coin flip. 2 to the first power is 2, and 1 plus 1 is 2. Okay, if we bring quantization up to 2, we'll get 3 possible values. If it's set to 3, we'll get 4 possible values, and so on. All the way up to 6 will give us 7 possible values. Cool, so that's how we use quantized random voltages, and we can combine them once again. I'll take the 2 to the nth power, send that to my H ramp, and plug my vertical ramp back in once again. And now we're back where we started. That's a little bit of a deep dive into quantized random voltages. What about the stored random voltages submodule? How does that work? Every time the unit starts up, it generates a sequence of 64 random values. And it will play those random values in sequence, updating every time we get a pulse input, which once again I'm providing with ornament and crime. So that's if you use this output, the one that has a flat distribution curve. Use that output and you're just getting those 64 quantized values in a sequence, looping endlessly. Things get interesting though if you use the other output. Now this probability knob is effective. It doesn't work on the other output. If probability is set up to the maximum, then we're once again going to get those 64 values playing back in sequence, one after another. But as we reduce the probability, we will get a narrower range of change. So it's going to reinterpret those 64 values, and it's going to move by a lesser amount than it would have with a higher probability. So what we get is kind of clusters of notes, if you will, that kind of stay within a general range, before they sort of pop out of that range and go into another range. So that's how the probability works. And it really is a very helpful control because we can go totally random, or we can set the probability to low, meaning that there's a lower chance that we're going to actually go to the next value in the sequence of 64 stored values. Instead of going to that value, we're going to go to something in between the current value and the next value in the sequence. Cool. That's how to use stored random voltages. Source of uncertainty is the module. It's the original, but of course it's not the only module we can use to generate random voltages. Here I'm using the pulp logic RND tile to generate a random voltage every time a pulse is received. It's similar to the quantized random voltages of the source of uncertainty, except there's no quantization going on here. It's putting out a random voltage between 0 and 5 volts every time a pulse is received. The overall patch uses a couple of prepared gradients. I've loaded a specially channel-packed image into the TBC2 media player. When I say channel-packed, that means that I've got different images in the different channels. I've got one gradient in the red channel and a completely different gradient in the blue channel. And those are going into the DSG3, shape 1 and shape 2 respectively, and being combined with the random voltages. And here we have the proc. It's in the mix here because I wanted to have a range slightly greater than 0 to 1. If you remember from my DSG3 tutorial, DSG3 will accept negative voltages. And so I'm pushing things a little bit here. I'm providing a voltage that goes above and below 0. It's bipolar. The reason I want a bipolar voltage going into DSG3 is to get a little bit of wave folding for free. The DSG3 shape outputs are multing into 3 arches. Shape 1 is going into arch input A, shape 2 is going into arch input B, and I'm finding different logical combinations of those and providing those as the RGB inputs to the encoder ESG3. That's the general flow of this patch. The pulse trigger for the random generator is ultimately coming from this DWO3, and I'm putting that through a comparator just to bump it up to 5 volts. Okay, so that's controlling the speed. The pulp logic RND tile has a cool feature where it will put out a sequence of variable length. When the knob is set to the fully counterclockwise position, all the way to the left, it's going to generate a new random value each time a pulse is received. If we increase this, though, we're going to get a sequence. If we go just a little bit up, we'll get a sequence length of 1. It's just going to freeze whatever the last random voltage it put out. Okay, that's a sequence length of 1. Bring that up a notch, and we'll get a sequence length of 2. If we go back down to an infinite sequence length, we'll just reset those random values. So if you don't like what you get, you just turn the knob all the way back down. So here you can see I'm getting 2 outputs that look really very similar. So I'll just send this back to an infinite sequence length and then up to a sequence length of 2 once again. Or a sequence length of 3 or 4 or whatever. And again, if you don't like what you got, just reset it by putting it back to an infinite length. It goes all the way up to 16. So if we crank this up fully clockwise, then we'll get a random sequence of 16 values. Things start to get more interesting when I modulate the 2 different gradient ramps. I'm using the same trigger applied to both of these RND tiles and getting 2 different random voltages out at every pulse. And finally, I can get some interesting transitions by using the pulp logic slew tile. I'll just take the output of those slew tiles. Those are going to be feeding my modulation. And of course, we're going to take the output of these random tiles and feed them into their respective slew tiles. And we'll get some cool transitions. Just need to increase that slew amount to a non-zero value. The slew tile has dip switches on the back to control the general range. I've got mine set to a maximum of half a second. But we can see this is working really well at this particular rate. I can play around with that rate, increasing the frequency with the DW03 and get this cool pattern effect. The only limitation of that slew tile is that it does not have a control voltage input, so we'll need to adjust that manually. Just as with a continuously varying random value, we can sample an instantaneous random value at any rate we wish. The clock pulse does not need to be at a constant frequency. The interval between pulses can also be random. In this case, the probability distribution is still flat. All the values are equally likely, but they happen at random times. So far, we've talked a lot about random values and not as much about random time intervals. We did see how to modulate the speed of fluctuating random voltages with another fluctuating random voltages, and that does give us random time intervals. Here, we've got a different situation, though, in which I've got a randomly timed trigger coming out of this pulp logic V-noise tile. And that is triggering the random tile so that we're getting a random value at a random interval. And because I want to do this a lot, especially regarding RGB patches, that's why I've got this whole battery of these pulp logic tiles. I've actually got 4 instances of this module combination of V-noise, random, and slew. We can achieve a similar result with source of uncertainty if we take the fluctuating random voltages output and plug it into the sample and hold pulse input. What's going to happen is that pulse will trigger every time fluctuating random voltages goes above 5 volts. And that pulse will then get sent out to one of these 2 alt outputs, and it'll ping pong between those two. That doesn't really matter in this case. We're only going to need one of them. I can take the alt output and plug it into the trigger input of my R&D tile. Now I've got a result similar to the V-noise output with randomly timed pulses triggering random values. Since I have 2 gradients that I can modulate, we can build on this and use 2 V-noise tiles driving 2 R&D tiles. The V-noise tiles do have a control voltage input to modulate the rate. So I've got that control voltage input turned up all the way on both of them. And I'm using a mat module as a static voltage. It's going through bridge to bump it up to 5 volts. In this way, we can control the rate of those 2 V-noise modules from a single control. And for a different visual effect, I can use those 2 alternating outputs of the source of uncertainty sample and hold to drive the R&D triggers. This gives a different look because we're only changing one of those values at a time. The other one is going to stay static, and that's because we're using those 2 alternating outputs of the source of uncertainty sample and hold. And if we add the slew tiles back into the mix, we can get some interesting transitions between these randomly morphing modulas. In a work of art, probability distribution is very important. If all the possible values are equally likely, it might not be very interesting. And so that's why we have artistic constructs like color wheels and musical scales or key signatures. So certain values or certain notes in the example of a key are more likely than other values. So Certain notes like the tonic are much more likely to occur in the composition, and that is again to sustain audience interest by giving them an intermittent reward. Other values, such as the chromatic notes that are outside the particular key signature, are used very sparingly or not at all, so their probability is very low. In the following demo, we'll see a couple ways of making a random source less random by modifying its probability distribution. And we use Ornament and Crime Plus with the hemispheres firmware to first quantize a random source so we constrain it to particular values. And we'll also see how to use a sine function to produce a pseudo bell curve distribution to the probability. The RND tile has a perfectly flat probability distribution. That means that any value is just as likely to come up as any other value. There's no weighting involved, and that's been the case for everything that we've seen so far, with the exception of the stored random voltages on the source of uncertainty. If you remember, that has a probability dial, which gives us the ability to favor certain clusters of values. But everything else so far has just been a flat probability distribution with no weighting. But what if we want some weighting? What if we want to favor some values over others? Then we can tweak that probability curve in various ways. One way that I can adjust the probability distribution is with the Ornament and Crime Plus hemispheres firmware, the applet called VectMorph for vector morph. It's basically a wavetable. We send in a value and we get some other value out that's an index from some waveform. And you can create your own waveform, so it's basically a little random access function generator. So I'm going to use that. I'm going to take my modulation, take it from the OCP channel 1, and the CV1 input is going to come from the R&D tile. And if we look at this in close-up, we will see that that little line is jumping around. That's an indicator of the current incoming value. We see that the output has only 3 possible values because that's the wave shape that I've created here. And by the way, I can unplug this just to show you if I have no source going in, then this potentiometer becomes basically a slider. There's a 5-volt signal normaled in here. So this is as if we had an incoming voltage of 0 or an incoming voltage of 5 volts. Okay, so I'll plug that one back in again. What we're seeing here is an equal probability of 3 values. This is just like the quantized random voltages on the source of uncertainty. The probability distribution is not flat because only certain values are allowed. But each of those values is equally likely to occur. Let's mix it up a little bit. I've got another VectMorph applet standing by on the other hemisphere, and that's going to be a sine wave. We're more likely to see certain values, the ones that are at the tops and bottoms of the waveform where it's flatter. Not only that, but we can shift the bias by controlling the phase manually. We see here the top parameter labeled C here because that's submodule C. That's the phase. So if I adjust this encoder knob and set this to, let's say, 90 degrees, that gives us a different probability distribution with the curve centered on some other value. And it doesn't end there. We can apply this wave shaping to any signal, including a continuous voltage. I can take the fluctuating random voltages from source of uncertainty and use that as the source for the VectMorph. And now we're going to see a different pattern than we would have seen otherwise. We're going to see certain parts of the tonal range more often. With a continuous signal like this, where the waveform slope is steeper, what will happen is it will move through those values more quickly. It's just like a function curve in animation. We may need to tweak things a little bit, maybe reduce the amplitude of that incoming control voltage because the source of uncertainty is pretty hot. There are many ways to change a probability distribution curve, aka function curve, aka contrast curve. We can use VU005, one of my favorite modules, which I devoted an entire lesson to. And there I used it for animation as well as tone mapping. Here we can use it to give a distribution to a random voltage source. I've got source of uncertainty, fluctuating random voltages, attenuated, and then going into VU005, because again, source of uncertainty is putting out up to 10 volts, and VU005 is optimized for 0 to 1 volts. That's what it's expecting to see, and that's what it will output. So I'll increase the level of the VU005, bring that into effect, and now I'm applying a sinusoidal transform to the fluctuating random voltages. And additionally, I have the shape knob, the little one here, and that applies a bias before the contrast curve is applied. And that allows us to shift the focus of tones to some other range. That's basically a bias control, just like we saw with the phase on the OCP. Very cool. So feel free to go crazy with this. You can also use the function generator, for example, in order to highlight certain tonal ranges in your probability distribution. Or you could use DSG3 or Arch to simply apply a logarithmic or exponential curve to that distribution. And of course, there are a million audio modules that you could potentially use to change that probability distribution. The sky is really the limit. Computers and digital algorithms can't really do randomness, but they're quite good at chaos. Here's an example of chaotic switching between 4 different video sources. And this is accomplished with Switcher and an applet of ornament and crime hemispheres called Rungler. Switcher is what's doing the heavy lifting of actually switching between the various sources. I've got 4 different video inputs going into the RGB inputs of Switcher. Additionally, I've got 2 control signals going into the A0 and A1 inputs. Those 0 and 1 inputs are video rate inputs. Currently, I'm only using a low frequency value coming in. And additionally, it's going through a sample and hold in order to constrain it to frame intervals. Those A0 and A1 inputs are binary, meaning that the effective values that those inputs can achieve will only be 0 or 1. There's a high-speed comparator on each input. If the incoming value exceeds 0.5, that results in a 1. If the incoming value is lower than 0.5, that results in a 0. So we have 2 bits of information here. This is a 2-bit binary number. And a 2-bit binary number can range from a decimal value of 0 to a decimal value of 3. The switcher inputs are not labeled 0 to 3, they're labeled 1 to 4. So let's just go through this. If A0 is 0 and A1 is 0, that'll give us a decimal value of 0, activating switcher input number 1. If A0 has a value of 1 and A1 has a value of 0, that'll give us a decimal value of 1, resulting in activation of switcher input number 2. If A0 is 0 and A1 is 1, that gives us a decimal value of 2, activating switcher input number 3. And finally, if both A0 and A1 have values of 1, that'll give us a decimal value of 3, activating switcher input number 4. So that's how this is all taking place. I'm sending values into A0 and A1. And again, if the threshold is over 0.5 volts, we'll get a 1. If it's under 0.5, we'll get a 0. And sending in 2 signals allows us to get the full range of the 2-bit number, with a range from 0 to 3, and that translates into the inputs 1 to 4. So what's driving these inputs? It's once again ornament and crime plus. And this time I'm using an applet called Rungler. It's a play on the title of The Jungle Book by Rudyard Kipling. This is an implementation of Rungler circuit. This is a shift register circuit that also has feedback built into it. If you're not familiar with a shift register, it's a way of achieving chaos using a very simple binary algorithm. We have a series of zeros and ones of a certain length. In this case, it's an 8-bit number. We have 8 registers. The lower 3 values are going to be sent out to the first output of the ornament and crime. That's, in this case, output A. The upper 3 values of our 8-bit number are going to be output here at the B output, or the second output of ornament and crime. Every time a clock trigger or gate is received at the first digital or binary input, 2 things will happen. Number 1, all the values that are in each register of this 8-bit number are going to shift to the next higher place. In other words, if we have a 0 in the first place, which is the ones place, then when a clock is received, that 0 is going to shift into the second register, which is the twos place. And each time a clock is received, that value is going to shift up to the next higher register. So that's the first thing that happens when a clock is received. The second thing that happens when a clock is received is a signal applied to the first CV input is sampled. If that value is over a certain threshold, then the ones value of the register will be set to 1, and if it's below the threshold, that value is set to 0. So it basically compares against a threshold value, and I've got that value set currently to about 2.5 volts. So that's an ordinary shift register, but the Rungler circuit adds feedback to the mix, and that's accomplished by providing a signal to the second digital input. And when this gate goes high, then instead of simply reading the results of the buffer, the current buffer value is not read and the output is held. Additionally, the lowest bit gets moved up to the highest bit, and that's where the feedback comes in. So we can do this without the feedback. We can just pull this plug out. And now we're seeing a very similar result. It's just not quite as chaotic. And to make this a little bit easier to visualize, I can also enable the display of my XY scope. The X value is the first set of outputs, and the Y value is the second set of outputs. And again, each one of those is a 3-bit number, giving us a total of 8 possible values. So that's why our little dot on the screen is moving around in different positions. It can take up to 64 different positions, but we're not using all that data in Switcher. Switcher is just taking that and slicing it into a binary value instead of an 8-bit value. It's only a 1-bit value. So basically, whenever that dot lands in a quadrant, that's going to activate one of the outputs. If it lands in the lower left quadrant, that's going to be a value of 0, 0. If it lands in the upper right quadrant, that's a value of 1, 1. Okay, so this is without any feedback, and it looks pretty chaotic even as it is. But once again, I can add that feedback back in by supplying a signal here to the second digital input. We'll also see these little displays changing. The farthest left bar is the lower register values. In other words, the lowest 3 bits. And the far right bar, that's the second output. That's the upper 3 bits. And in the middle, we see an indication of the voltage of the incoming control signal. In this case, I'm just sending a sine wave from the oscillator. It's been scaled up to 5 volts, so it works well with the OCP. The clock signals are just triggers or gates, and those are also coming from oscillators, but they're going through comparators in order to make them clean gates that are at exactly 5 volts. So we can see the output here on these 2 bars. We don't see the digital inputs, but we do see the control voltage or continuous analog input. And if we change the frequency of these various oscillators, then we'll get different chaotic results. If I reduce the first digital input, that's the overall clock. So when I bring that down, we're seeing chaotic transitions, but they're happening far less often. I'll bring that back up a bit. And the second oscillator I've got going through a comparator here is applying voltage to digital input number 2. And it's the interference between those 2 frequencies that results in a particular chaotic pattern. If I increase or decrease the frequency of either one of those, we're going to get a different pattern. Finally, I have the third oscillator. It's just a sine wave. It's being bumped up to 5 volts. And it is a continuous value. It is also being sampled. If we increase or decrease that frequency, again, that will change the pattern of the chaos. Notice that just then we saw that the system kind of got stuck for a while in a particular value. And that is a property of the Rungler and of shift registers in general. This is chaos. It's not randomness. It's going to produce some patterns that are going to vary over time. In a musical sense, this is an aleatoric composition that's evolving over time. It is not random. It's chaotic. All right, that's how to use a digital algorithm to create chaotic transitions or cuts, in this case using switcher as our engine for transition. We can apply the same principles of chaos and feedback to high frequency signals. If we have a chaotic system that's high frequency enough, then in the video synthesizer, that will be interpreted as an image. And so we can create textures such as video snow. And we do that mainly through feedback. And you can really patch any module into itself and see what happens. You can't break anything unless you connect multiple outputs to a single input. Under ordinary circumstances, the worst that can happen in a feedback patch is your screen will just go white because the feedback value went out of control. In this following demo, I'm going to use stairs to do that because it gives us the widest range of possible textures or snow qualities. Do not attempt to adjust your computer monitor. We are controlling the picture. We can make it noisy. We can make it more noisy. We can make it different noisy, all through the magic of video synthesis. This is using stairs and proc to generate a variety of noisy textures via feedback, and some audio rate noise as well in order to really make this an artistic endeavor. This is a super fun technique, and we're going to also integrate this with an actual video image coming from the airwaves. I do want to mention that ordinary video compression, like you would see on YouTube or Vimeo, is not optimized for a signal like this. Video codecs were designed for naturalistic imagery, like human faces and so on, and designed to code perceptually to discard information that we probably won't notice is missing. Video snow or highly chaotic, high-frequency noise has way too much entropy for an ordinary video compression scheme to handle. The downside of this for video artists is that when our work is presented on the internet, it sometimes suffers because those codecs were not designed for such complex and fast-moving imagery. What you see on YouTube or Vimeo might not be what I see on my screen right now. To try to compensate for that, I can show you some of this noise in slow motion. Here's the simplest version of this patch. It's just feedback through stairs. And this is both chaotic and random. It's chaotic like almost all feedback. It's going to produce some varying patterns that are so complex that we can't predict them. It's also random in this case because stairs is a high gain amplifier. And if especially we take the output from one of the higher stages, such as the 64 times stage, we're going to get a level of amplification that's actually going to amplify the noise inherent in the circuit. That's called Johnson noise or thermal noise. It's just always there in every analog circuit. And in this case, we're amplifying that noise up so much that it's actually having an effect on the signal. And additionally, we're feeding that back, so we're getting chaos and noise at the same time. Let's analyze this very simple patch. We've got a static voltage coming out of proc, and it's going into one of the inputs of stairs. Stairs has got red, green, and blue inputs, and they are internally summed before they hit the folder circuit, and they're summed according to the luminance formula. Luma is calculated by weighting the red, green, and blue channels differently to account for our perception of color. Green looks bright to us, so the Luma formula weights towards green. Red is the next brightest, and blue is the least bright. So we'll get different results if we go into the various inputs of stairs, because the inputs are, of course, internally self-normaled. If we plug into the red input, that's going to flow downward into the green and blue inputs. This is at full strength at this point. If I plug into the green input, though, that's going to weight the signal by about a factor of 0.7. And if I go into the blue input, that's going to weight it by a factor of only 0.1, 1/10 strength. And that's good in this case because the lower amplitude of that incoming signal is going to give us more range with the knobs, the potentiometers, to dial in various textures. So you can see if I adjust this step CV, we're going to get different results. And we have better range on that if we attenuate the signal by a factor of 10 in this case. So we've also got a feedback loop going. The 64 times output is feeding into the steps CV input, and that is in turn malting off to the encoder. Now I can adjust steps CV depth, or I can adjust the proc static voltage. Either one is going to have an effect on the texture or quality of the noise. Very small adjustments to these pots is going to have quite a lot of influence on the end result. So be slow, careful, and methodical with your movements. If you go out of range, then the system will spiral out of control and you'll get a perfectly black or perfectly white signal, and you'll just need to start over again, dial all of your parameters back to neutral, and then dial them in order to get the art-directed look that you're going for. At certain settings, we won't get video noise, but we'll get a series of bands of various frequencies, and we can adjust our parameters in order to get a balance between the super high frequency video snow and the lower frequency chaotic noise, and this is looking pretty cool to me. I'd also like to incorporate audio rate noise. That's going to give me another texture I can add to the mix. And I'm once again using source of uncertainty, but we could use any audio module that has an audio noise output. Source of uncertainty gives us 3 audio rate noise outputs, plus 3 dB per octave. That's so-called blue noise. It's weighted towards the high frequencies. The flat output is white noise. All of the audio frequencies are at the same amplitude. And the minus 3 decibels per octave output is pink noise. It's weighted towards the low frequencies. And those all have their own characteristic looks when they're translated into a video signal. Okay, I'm just going to use the blue noise output because that gives me that high frequency effect I wanted to achieve. I'm going to plug that source of uncertainty into proc, and I want to actually do double duty with this. I want to use it to directly modulate the video source and also to modulate the feedback from stairs. To do that, I'm going to plug my source of uncertainty into the B2 input, so that signal will flow to both the second and third outputs of proc. Okay, so we've got this third output currently going into stairs. Let's see what this looks like if we once again look at the output of stairs directly. And we'll need to increase the level of our source of uncertainty and the bias or static voltage and find a balance between those to get the art-directed look that we want. Any change that you make will probably require adjusting something else in order to find a delicate balance. Cool, so here's a completely different look that we achieved by adding a little bit of audio rate noise into the mix. Okay, let's incorporate an actual video image into the mix here. I've got that coming from a TV tuner going into TBC2. I'm going to plug that into the A inputs of this SMX3, and then the SMX3 output is going to go directly to the encoder. Okay, at this point, I'm just passing my video signal more or less transparently through the SMX3. We want to add some of our chaos elements in. So I've got the output of stairs here. I do want to send that through proc. I don't want to send it directly into SMX3 because if I did that, I would need to adjust all three knobs in order to keep that noise source monochrome or black and white. So in this case, I'm going to take that output of stairs, put it into the B1 input of proc. Then we're going to take that output, it's going to go into SMX3 B1. And now I'm mixing that noise with the video image. And using proc, I can choose to either subtract or add the noise. It's not really going to make a big difference because that noise source is pretty much all black and white. And since its frequencies are more or less evenly distributed, it really doesn't matter whether I add or subtract. And then I also want to add my audio rate noise into the mix. I've got that here coming out of the second output of proc. Send that to the C1 input of SMX3. And you'll see I've got the input knobs set to their maximum for the inputs of SMX3. Now I can play around with the balance of how much I'm adding or subtracting the feedback noise and the audio rate noise. And at extreme settings, we really lose most of the picture, but I think this is a pretty cool looking effect. And that is how to use stairs to create video noise textures, and also how to incorporate that with audio rate noise and with a video image. All right, let's put it all together. Let's put chaos and randomness and naturalistic imagery all together and produce something really quite fun and wild and hopefully interesting. Here's a fairly complex patch which uses about 30 modules, and that's less than half of my total system. A bunch of those modules are those Pulp Logic single-purpose tiles. So it's not as complex as it sounds. 30 modules is really only moderately complex. The core of it is I'm finding the difference between two TV tuner signals. I'm feeding TV tuners into decoders, decoding that to RGB, and then I'm using 3 LZX Arch modules to find the difference between those two signals. We could just as easily use DSG3. You would need 2 of them to do it. And in order to make the image move, I'm also providing a modulation signal, and that is biasing the video up and down in preparation for going into other modules. Let's take a look. It all starts from the upper left here. Here are my decoders. I've got the VU03B and the TBC2 decoders. I could have done this using TBC2. I was just choosing to use the VU03B as well in order to avoid any possible crosstalk between the TBC2 channels A and B. But this image is so chaotic that we probably wouldn't notice any crosstalk anyway. The decoders are going into either a proc or an SMX3. We could use either in this case. They are there for the purpose of adding some modulation signal to the video. And proc has bias built into it. You can see I've got the bias knobs turned all the way to the left. So I'm biasing that signal fully down in order to compensate for the modulation signal I'm adding, so I don't end up with a signal that goes beyond 1 volt. And then I'm also using SMX3. That's just to show that it's possible to do that. But SMX3 does not have a bias built into it. You'll need to supply some static voltage in order to accomplish that. And that's what I've done here with this patch cable, which is going all the way over here. To the far right, I've got the mat module that's just supplying a 1 volt signal. So from these proc and SMX3, the modulated video is going through the following chain. First, it's going to the triple function generator, and it's being solarized. The whites in particular are being pushed down into black, meaning that the signal does not go all the way up to the full range of 0 to 1. So from here, from the triple function generator, I'm going through VU005, which gives me the ability to stretch the signal back up to a full range and also apply soft clipping or sine wave shaping in order to give it a little bit more contrast. And from the VU005 outputs, I'm going into inputs A and B of arch, and then finding the absolute value, and that's what's going directly into the encoder. Okay, so that's the video side of things. Now let's talk about the modulation side. It's kind of complicated because I wanted to combine a flickering or flashing effect with a softer modulation which comes from Oscillator, in which I'm able to apply 3 different sine waves that are all equally out of phase in order to create a sort of a color cycling effect. So in order to accomplish that, I'm using crossfade. And in fact, I've got 2 crossfades. I've got one over here, and I've got one over here. And the purpose there is to mix the flickering or strobing effect with the oscillators. And I've just got them at a 50-50 blend currently. So let's talk about the effect of the oscillator. I've got 2 of them here, one for each of the TV tuner signals. And we see that I've got the 0 degree, 120 degree, and 240 degree outputs going into red, green, and blue respectively. And again, those are all equally out of phase, and that gives us this kind of rolling color cycling-ish kind of effect. Additionally, I'm frequency modulating the oscillators. If we trace the control voltage of the oscillators, we'll see that it's coming from this pulp logic at off tile in order to bring the signal into the correct range. The oscillator is expecting a signal between 0 and 1, but the signal I'm providing it is ultimately coming from the Buchla and tip-top audio source of uncertainty, the fluctuating random voltages, which range from 0 to 10 volts. So I'm just bringing that way down in order to feed it into the oscillator control voltage or frequency modulation input. Okay, so that's the oscillator side where we're scrolling through the red, green, and blue colors, but we're also speeding up and slowing down that by providing this fluctuating frequency modulation. Now let's talk about the flickering or strobing effect. What I'm doing here is I'm supplying an instantaneous random voltage to each one of the red, green, and blue channels in order to bias that up or down by some random amount. It's ultimately all coming from this pulp logic V noise, which is providing a pulse or trigger at a random interval. And I can increase or decrease the general speed up the general overall speed of the random pulse, or slow it down. From here, it's going in through a sample hold signal chain. I've covered that in another video. Sample and hold is being used here in order to constrain the flicker to the vertical interval. In other words, so we don't get frame tearing, we don't have a transition in the middle of a frame, and that's accomplished by taking this sawtooth from a VU009 through a comparator, which is then providing the trigger for the sample hold. And then my actual signal, the V noise, is going to the sample hold input, and then the sample hold output is going into 3 random modules, RND tiles from Pulp Logic. Every time a trigger or pulse is received, a new random voltage is generated. And then from there, I'm generating another set of random values that is related to the random values generated by these pulp logic tiles. We'll see that each one of them is connected to the input of one of these timbre modules, which is a Buchla-inspired wave folder. And that's producing another value from that random value through wave folding. And it's deterministic. It's not random. If I supply a particular voltage to the timbre module, I'll get the same output every time. But it gives me the ability to produce another set of random values or voltages. And I've actually set this up so I can do feedback between these timbre modules, but I'm not currently using that. The random outputs are going to one of these crossfaders, and the timbre outputs that are the mutated version of the random values are going to the other crossfade. In order to do that, I'm going through the 5-to-1 module down here from Brown Shoes only, just to bring those into the correct range, because those are at least 5 volts and probably more. Okay, so that's the patch. I'm using several different forms of randomness. First, the source of uncertainty fluctuating random voltages. Those are providing frequency modulation for the oscillator, speeding it up and slowing it down. I'm also generating randomly timed pulses using the V-noise tile. That is in turn triggering the generation of random voltage values. Those are going into the timbre module in order to fold those values and produce a set of related random values. All of that is getting mixed together using the crossfades in order to bias the signal up and down in the RGB channels before they reach the triple function generator, the VO05, and the triple arches. That about wraps up our epic journey through the lands of randomness, chaos, and uncertainty. I hope that you've learned a lot. I certainly have. I've learned so much in making this, and I've had such a good time. Now I feel like I have a better and deeper understanding of information and how it applies to randomness and chaos. And I feel like I can better apply those principles in my work. So I hope I've imparted that to you. So as usual, go out and make something weird. Because of course, weird is surprising. Weird is high entropy. It's novel and therefore interesting. All right, so that's all for me. I will see you at the next juncture of our video synth tools and techniques journey. Thanks for watching.